Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the most radical thinkers of the 19th century, a philosopher who dared to ask uncomfortable questions about morality, religion, and the meaning of life. At a time when old certainties were collapsing, he didn't call for despair, but for courage, the courage to create ourselves anew. His philosophy is not abstract theory, but a challenge, a call to break free from conformity, embrace struggle, and live with passion and authenticity. Becoming who you really are was, for Nietzsche, the deepest task of human existence. Nietzsche's philosophy begins with a radical challenge to what he called herd morality. By this, he meant the set of values, customs, and beliefs that societies adopt and enforce, often without question. Herd morality emphasizes safety, conformity, and obedience. It rewards humility, meekness, and sameness while discouraging individuality and strength. Nietzsche believed that most people live passively under the weight of this morality, never pausing to ask whether the values they follow truly reflect their own nature. For him, this was the first great obstacle to self-becoming. To become who you really are, you must first learn to break away from the collective voice that tells you how to think, how to act, and even how to feel. This does not mean Nietzsche simply encouraged rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was not enough to reject society's rules and then fall into a shallow form of contrarianism. The deeper task was to examine where these rules come from, why they have power, and how they shape us from the inside out. He traced much of herd morality to what he called slave morality, a moral system that grew out of weakness and resentment. In his view, the powerless and oppressed, rather than affirming their own strength, created a moral code that demonized strength itself. Qualities like ambition, vitality, and assertiveness were recast as dangerous or sinful, while meekness, humility, and obedience were declared virtuous. Over time, this morality became dominant in European culture, reinforced by religion and tradition, until it seemed natural and unquestionable. Nietzsche insisted that we must expose this history if we want to escape it. For Nietzsche, freedom begins with suspicion. He invites us to look at the values we take for granted and to ask, who benefits from these values? Do they serve life and growth, or do they suppress them? When society tells you to live modestly, is it really concerned with your well-being, or is it trying to keep you small? When it tells you to sacrifice your desires for duty, is this guidance toward excellence or a way to control you? Nietzsche's point is not that all morality is false, but that much of it is unexamined and serves forces outside of ourselves. Only by questioning inherited morality can we begin to discover values that emerge from our own strength. This questioning requires courage, because stepping outside the herd means facing isolation. Nietzsche compared most people to sheep who prefer the comfort of the flock, where they are protected by shared rules and expectations. To step away is to face the wilderness of uncertainty, where no ready-made moral code can tell you what to do. Many people fear this solitude and retreat back into conformity. But Nietzsche argued that this discomfort is necessary for genuine selfhood. Just as a sculptor must chip away at stone to reveal the figure inside, so must each individual strip away layers of borrowed values to uncover their authentic core. The process is painful, but it is also the condition for greatness. Nietzsche's critique of herd morality was not meant to deny the value of community or human connection. Rather, he wanted us to distinguish between shallow belonging, which comes at the cost of individuality, and deeper forms of connection that can only arise between self-created individuals. When people live by herd morality, they relate to each other as copies of the same template, reproducing predictable behaviors and thoughts. True relationships, by contrast, arise when unique individuals stand side by side, not bound by conformity, but drawn together by shared strength. Such encounters, Nietzsche believed, spark creativity, vitality, and the flourishing of culture. Ultimately, the challenge of herd morality is that it seduces us with comfort. It tells us that we will be safe if we stay small, humble, and obedient. Nietzsche saw through this promise and declared it unworthy of the human spirit. To become who you really are requires breaking free of these chains, even when the cost is loneliness or struggle. It demands that you replace borrowed values with those born from your own will and character. It is the first step in transforming life from passive existence into active creation, a movement away from the herd and toward the freedom of becoming. When Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he was not making a casual or triumphant statement, but offering a profound diagnosis of European culture. By this phrase, he meant that the old foundations of meaning, once held together by religious belief, were crumbling. For centuries, Christianity had provided a structure that gave life coherence. It answered questions of purpose, offered moral guidance, and provided comfort in suffering. With the rise of science, secularism, and historical criticism, those foundations were collapsing. People no longer believed with the same certainty, and yet they had not developed new values to replace what was lost. Nietzsche understood this moment as both a crisis and an opportunity. The death of God meant that the world no longer had a fixed center of meaning. It was up to human beings to decide what kind of life and values they would affirm. This diagnosis was unsettling because most people still clung to moral systems, derived from Christianity even after they had abandoned faith. They wished to keep the ethical rules without the religious framework that gave them authority. Nietzsche saw this as a contradiction. If God is dead, then the moral systems rooted in God's will cannot stand on their own. The danger of this inconsistency, he warned, was nihilism, the sense that life has no meaning, that values are arbitrary, and that nothing matters. Nihilism was, for Nietzsche, the shadow cast by the death of God. It represented the collapse of all certainty, and it threatened to drag people into despair, passivity, or cynicism. But Nietzsche did not believe that nihilism was the end of the story. Rather, he considered it a necessary stage in the evolution of human culture. Once the old values collapse, we are forced to confront the question of what values we will create for ourselves. The death of God tears down an old house, but in the rubble lies the possibility of building something new. Nietzsche urged people not to mourn the loss of old certainties, but to see this moment as a challenge to embrace freedom. Without divine authority dictating what is good or evil, human beings can assume responsibility for shaping meaning and creating life-affirming values. This responsibility, however, is heavy. Nietzsche warned that many would not be able to bear it and would seek substitutes for God. These substitutes could take the form of ideology, nationalism, blind faith in science, or rigid political doctrines. He saw these as dangerous because they were simply new versions of the same problem, placing authority outside of oneself and avoiding the challenge of creating meaning from within. For Nietzsche, the death of God was not a call to replace one idol with another, but to recognize that the age of idols had ended. The task was not to find a new absolute, but to become capable of living without absolutes. In this light, Nietzsche's declaration was both destructive and creative. It was destructive in that it stripped away illusions, forcing people to see that the world does not come prepackaged with meaning. It was creative in that it opened the door to self-overcoming and transformation. To live after the death of God is to live in a world where meaning is not given but made. Each individual has the chance to shape their life like a work of art, guided not by external commandments, but by their own deepest will. The crisis of meaning that Nietzsche foresaw has become a defining feature of modern life. Without shared certainties, people often feel adrift, anxious, or alienated. Nietzsche would say that this sense of loss is the necessary price of freedom. To become who you really are, you must face the abyss left by the death of God and refuse to retreat into comforting illusions. Instead, you must find the strength to say yes to life even without guarantees, to create values that affirm existence in all its chaos and uncertainty. Only then can the collapse of old beliefs become the beginning of a new and more authentic way of living. For Nietzsche, the driving force of life is not survival, comfort, or even happiness, but what he called the will to power. This idea is often misunderstood as a desire for domination or control over others, but Nietzsche's meaning was broader and more profound. The will to power is the fundamental impulse of all living things to grow, expand, overcome resistance, and assert themselves in the world. It is the creative energy that pushes plants toward the sun, animals toward strength, and human beings toward self-transformation. Life, in Nietzsche's view, is not a passive state of existence but an active struggle of forces, and within this struggle the will to power reveals itself as the essence of vitality. Understanding the will to power means seeing that existence is dynamic rather than static. To live is not simply to remain alive but to strive, to test limits, to seek challenges. Nietzsche rejected the idea that the highest goal of life is comfort or security. He thought these goals reflected a timid outlook, one that feared the demands of existence. Instead, he celebrated struggle, difficulty, and even suffering as conditions through which life grows stronger. A person who seeks only safety and pleasure is, in his eyes, living a diminished life, avoiding the very experiences that make true growth possible. The will to power, then, is not about avoiding hardship, but embracing it as the raw material for becoming more than what one already is. This concept applies not only to individuals, but to cultures and ideas. Civilizations that thrive are those that channel their will to power into art, philosophy, science, and creativity. Those that collapse are ones that lose this vital force, becoming stagnant and complacent. Nietzsche admired cultures that affirmed life through bold creation and condemned those that turned against life by promoting denial, weakness, or passivity. In his view, the strength of a culture could be measured by its ability to express vitality through greatness, rather than suppress it through conformity. For individuals, the will to power manifests in the drive to overcome oneself. Nietzsche often spoke of self-overcoming as the central human task. This means not only facing external challenges, but also confronting one's own limitations, fears, and habits. Every person carries within themselves obstacles that prevent growth, whether it be laziness, doubt, or the weight of inherited values. To follow the will to power is to turn inward and struggle against these limits, transforming them into opportunities for strength. Self-overcoming is not a single act, but a lifelong process, a continuous striving to become more, to refine one's character, and to live with greater intensity. In this sense, Nietzsche's philosophy is deeply affirmative. He did not view struggle and conflict as misfortunes to be eliminated, but as conditions that give life meaning. Just as a sculptor needs resistance from stone to shape a figure, human beings need challenges to shape their existence. Without resistance, there is no growth. Without difficulty, there is no triumph. The will to power teaches us to see hardship not as an enemy, but as a partner in the process of becoming. This attitude turns suffering into strength and transforms chaos into creation. Nietzsche also contrasted the will to power with the pursuit of mere survival. He argued that reducing life to the biological struggle to stay alive diminishes its richness. Animals survive, but human beings have the capacity to create, to imagine, to go beyond what is necessary. The will to power is this capacity expressed at its highest, the ability to turn necessity into art, to transform existence into something worth affirming. In this way, Nietzsche's thought is not about brute force, but about the creative, life-enhancing power that makes existence radiant. When Nietzsche spoke of becoming who you really are, he was pointing toward the will to power as the inner source that drives such becoming. To live authentically is to recognize this force within oneself and to channel it into a life of self-overcoming. It is to reject the passive pursuit of comfort and to embrace the active struggle of growth. The will to power invites each individual to see themselves not as fixed beings, but as works in progress, capable of endless transformation. It is through this continual striving that life gains its meaning, and it is here that the task of becoming truly begins. Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman, is one of his most provocative and misunderstood concepts. It is not meant to describe a literal superior race or a political ruler, but an ideal of human self-creation and self-overcoming. The Übermensch is the person who has broken free from the weight of herd morality and nihilism, who has faced the collapse of old values, and who has succeeded in creating a new way of living grounded in strength, creativity, and affirmation. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch is a symbol of what human beings can become when they rise above mediocrity and take responsibility for shaping themselves and their world. The context for this idea is the death of God and the crisis of meaning that follows. When the old sources of value lose their authority, humanity faces a dangerous vacuum. Many will retreat into despair or cling to substitute idols, but Nietzsche envisioned another possibility. The Übermensch represents that possibility, the human being who refuses to fall into nihilism and instead embraces the challenge of creating meaning. This figure embodies the courage to live without fixed certainties and the strength to affirm life, even in the face of suffering and chaos. Nietzsche contrasts the Übermensch with what he calls the last man, a type of person who seeks only comfort, safety, and shallow pleasures. The last man avoids risk, flees from suffering, and settles for mediocrity. He is content to live a small and easy life, free of struggle but also free of greatness. Nietzsche feared that modern society, with its obsession with security and convenience, was breeding this type of human being. Against this backdrop, the Übermensch stands as a counter-ideal, one who embraces danger, strives for growth, and lives with intensity. The tension between these two figures illustrates Nietzsche's belief that the future of humanity depends on whether we choose complacency or creation. The path to the Übermensch is not one of domination over others, but of mastery over oneself. Nietzsche repeatedly emphasized that greatness comes from self-overcoming, from the ability to confront one's own limitations and transform them into strength. The Übermensch is not born, but created through the ongoing process of struggle, discipline, and creativity. This process requires rejecting borrowed values and instead cultivating one's own. It is the act of becoming the artist of one's life, shaping existence not according to external rules, but according to an inner vision. In this sense, the Übermensch is not a tyrant, but a creator, not a destroyer of others, but a transformer of oneself. Central to this figure is the affirmation of life. The Übermensch does not deny the hardships of existence or seek refuge in illusions of an afterlife. Instead, he embraces the whole of life, including suffering and failure, as part of its richness. This attitude of affirmation is what distinguishes him from those who resent life or seek to escape it. Nietzsche believed that the highest expression of strength is the ability to say yes to life in its entirety, to welcome even its most difficult aspects as opportunities for growth. The Übermensch embodies this yes-saying spirit, turning existence into a work of art rather than a burden to be endured. What makes this ideal so challenging is that it cannot be reduced to a formula or a universal set of values. Each person must discover their own path, their own vision of what it means to create and affirm. The Übermensch is not a model to be copied, but a call to authenticity, an invitation to move beyond imitation and live out one's unique potential. Nietzsche saw this as the true destiny of humanity, not to remain stuck in conformity or nihilism, but to rise into the freedom of self-creation. The Übermensch remains one of Nietzsche's most inspiring and unsettling contributions because it places the burden of meaning squarely on our shoulders. It tells us that there is no authority higher than ourselves, no ready-made answers to rely upon. To become who you really are is to take up this burden with courage, to resist the temptation of the last man, and to affirm life through the ongoing work of creation. The Übermensch is not a finished product, but a direction, a horizon toward which we can strive. In it, Nietzsche expressed his conviction that humanity's highest calling is not to be content with what it is, but to surpass itself. Among Nietzsche's most striking ideas is his teaching of eternal recurrence, a thought experiment that serves as both a test of character and a guide to living authentically. He asks us to imagine that a demon comes to us in the loneliest moment of our lives and declares, "This life you are living, with all its joys and sorrows, every moment, every detail, you will have to live again, infinitely, in exactly the same way. There will be no variation, no escape, only the endless return of the same existence." For most people, this vision would be unbearable, a curse too heavy to endure. But Nietzsche invites us to see it differently. If you could affirm this eternal recurrence, if you could embrace your life so fully that you would choose to live it again and again, then you would have reached the highest form of life affirmation. This thought experiment is not meant as a literal claim about the structure of the universe, but as a challenge. It forces us to ask whether we are living in such a way that we could joyfully repeat our existence. If the idea fills us with dread, then perhaps we are living inauthentically, avoiding our deepest potential, or clinging to values that suffocate rather than elevate us. If, however, we can say yes to this possibility, then we have transformed our relationship to life. We no longer see it as something to be endured until a better afterlife or dismissed as meaningless, but as something worthy in its entirety, down to its smallest details. The eternal recurrence confronts us with the ultimate question: do you affirm life, not just in part, but as a whole? Connected to this is Nietzsche's idea of amor fati, the love of fate. To practice amor fati is not merely to accept what happens to us, but to love it, to will it, to embrace it as necessary. Nietzsche wanted us to stop wishing life were different, to cease longing for some imagined perfection or escape from suffering. Instead, he urged us to take everything that comes, even pain and loss, as integral to our becoming. Every hardship is not an obstacle, but a condition for growth. Every failure a hidden form of strength. To love fate is to live without resentment, to see every aspect of existence as part of the great artwork of life. This attitude transforms suffering. Most people try to avoid or deny pain, hoping for comfort and security. But Nietzsche saw this as a weakness that diminishes life. If we can instead embrace suffering as necessary, even beautiful, then we become capable of turning it into power. The eternal recurrence makes this demand absolute. If you must live the same pain endlessly, then the only way to endure it is to transform your relationship with it, to see it not as punishment but as part of the fullness of life. In this way, Nietzsche calls us to a radical form of affirmation, one that does not shrink from the hardest truths but celebrates them as conditions for greatness. Amor fati and eternal recurrence thus represent the highest test of Nietzsche's philosophy of becoming. They demand that we take responsibility for our lives so completely that we would choose them again, without alteration. They call us to live not with regret or hesitation, but with the fullness of creative acceptance. To love one's fate is to stand in the middle of existence and say yes to it all, to embrace even chaos as necessary for beauty. To affirm eternal recurrence is to live with such intensity and authenticity that nothing would need to be erased. These ideas together challenge us to transform our entire outlook on existence. Life is not something to escape or transcend, but something to embrace endlessly, with courage and joy, as the very arena of becoming who we truly are. Nietzsche believed that one of the most vital approaches to life was to treat it as an artistic and playful act. For him, existence should not be reduced to mere survival, obedience to rules, or the pursuit of comfort. Instead, it should be lived creatively, as if one were shaping a work of art. This vision is tied to his conviction that to become who you really are, you must move beyond rigid systems of morality and external authority and embrace the possibility of creating meaning from within yourself. Art, for Nietzsche, is not simply the production of paintings or music, but a way of living that treats existence itself as a canvas, one where values, choices, and actions are strokes of color. To live artistically is to recognize that life is not given with inherent meaning, but is something we must actively shape. Nietzsche associated this creative spirit with playfulness. He often wrote about the image of the child as a symbol of rebirth and authenticity. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he described 3 stages of transformation: the camel, which bears the weight of duty, the lion, which rebels against old values, and the child, which creates anew. The child, for Nietzsche, embodies innocence, spontaneity, and the freedom to say yes to life. A child plays not because it must or because it has a goal, but because play is the pure expression of vitality. This playfulness is what allows the child to create without resentment, to begin again without being trapped in the burdens of the past. Nietzsche saw this quality as essential to self-becoming, because only through play can we generate new values and possibilities without fear. The notion of play also redefines how we relate to struggle and suffering. Instead of viewing hardship as an enemy, Nietzsche urges us to approach it with the spirit of a game, where challenges are not obstacles, but opportunities to test and expand ourselves. To play is to enter into struggle willingly, to take risks without demanding certainty of the outcome. In this sense, Nietzsche's philosophy rejects a heavy, joyless attitude toward existence and replaces it with a lighter, more dynamic stance. Life becomes less about enduring burdens and more about creatively engaging with them, turning even pain into a source of beauty. Art, for Nietzsche, also represented a way of resisting nihilism. When old values collapse, many people fall into despair or meaninglessness, but the artistic spirit offers another path. Instead of mourning what has been lost, we can create new forms of meaning, just as an artist creates a new world on the canvas. This act of creation does not need an ultimate justification. It is valuable because it is an affirmation of life itself. In art, Nietzsche saw the highest expression of the will to power, not as domination, but as the overflowing energy that invents, shapes, and gives form to chaos. To live artistically is to embrace chaos and turn it into something meaningful, to impose form without erasing the richness of existence. This approach to life is not about frivolity or carelessness, but about cultivating a deep seriousness within play. Nietzsche understood that life is difficult, filled with suffering and uncertainty, but he believed that the best response is not to retreat into rigidity or despair, but to meet it with creativity. To live with art and play is to take responsibility for shaping one's existence while refusing to be crushed by its weight. It is to face the absurdity of life not with resignation, but with laughter and joy. Becoming who you really are, then, is not a solemn duty to be fulfilled, but an adventure to be lived. It is not about conforming to an ideal set by others, but about experimenting, exploring, and creating as an artist does. To embody this attitude is to live with freedom, to invent oneself continuously, and to transform existence into something worth affirming. Nietzsche's vision of art and play invites us to approach life with the creativity of the artist and the lightness of the child, seeing in every moment not a burden to be carried but a possibility to be created anew. A dramatic oil painting of a lone figure standing on a high cliff under a vast stormy sky, golden light breaking through dark clouds, symbolizing courage against despair. In the distance, a dark crowd moves in one direction while the lone figure steps away toward a glowing horizon, embodying the break from herd morality. A giant tree grows out of rocky barren ground, struck by lightning, symbolizing will to power and growth. Above, a heroic silhouette gazes at the cosmos filled with stars and galaxies, the vision of the Übermensch. Amidst ruins and fire, the figure sits calmly, smiling at the stars, embracing amor fati. The scene blends with surreal elements of an artist painting his own reality on a canvas that merges with the world, symbolizing life as art and continual self-overcoming. Rich textures, deep shadows, glowing highlights, 19th century oil painting style, dramatic and philosophical atmosphere.